It was late March 1922 when I arrived in the small, remote village of Hinterkaifeck. I had been sent there by my editor to investigate a story that had been circling the rural towns for weeks. A brutal and unsettling murder that had taken place in one of the most isolated farmhouses in all of Bavaria. I never could have imagined just how deep this mystery would go, nor how it would change me forever. I had heard of Hinterkaifeck, of course. The place had always been shrouded in an eerie quietness. A lonely farmhouse, far from the nearest neighbor, nestled in the middle of a dense forest. They say the woods surrounding the farmhouse were thick and impenetrable, making it feel like the house was cut off from the rest of the world, almost as if it existed in its world, separate from time. I pulled up to the scene in my car, the tires crunching over the frozen ground as I approached the farmhouse. The road leading to the house had been abandoned for years, and it seemed as though nature itself was reclaiming the land. Snow had fallen heavily over the previous days, and the landscape looked like it belonged to a forgotten time. The farmhouse, once the home of the Gruber family, stood eerily silent, its windows darkened and its doors shut tight. I had read all the reports, the tragic story of how 6 members of the Gruber family had been killed, their bodies left in the farmhouse like discarded dolls. But it wasn't until I stepped inside that the full weight of the tragedy truly sank in. As I walked through the doorway, I felt an immediate sense of coldness, a strange and unnatural chill that seemed to penetrate my bones. The air was heavy, thick with silence. The dust on the floor, though it had been disturbed by investigators and curious onlookers, was still visible. It was as if time had stopped the day of the murders, and nothing had changed since then. The house was small, with narrow hallways that felt suffocating and claustrophobic. The smell of decay lingered in the air, and the remnants of the family's life were still scattered around. Old furniture, broken and covered in dust, sat unused, and children's toys lay abandoned in corners. I felt like an intruder, walking through the intimate spaces where the family had lived and died. It was said that the Gruber family had been murdered in cold blood, and each member of the family was struck down with brutal force. The story went that Andreas Gruber, the patriarch, had been found in his bed, his head smashed in with a blunt object. His wife, Crescens, had met the same fate. Their daughter, Victoria, who was the mother of 2 young children, had been slaughtered similarly. The children, little Kazilia and Joseph, had been killed as well. Even the maid, Maria, who had been staying with them for a short time, had been found dead in her bed. It was the sheer savagery of the killings that haunted me. The Grubers had been murdered while they slept. And yet, what made this story even more chilling was what had been discovered after the murders. The house had not been locked from the outside. It was found that someone, likely the killer, had been living inside the house for several days after the murders. The windows had been closed, the doors locked from the inside. Strange sounds had been heard coming from the house in the days after the murders, and there were reports from neighbors who claimed they had seen lights flickering inside the house at night. But there was no trace of the killer. No clues. No fingerprints. No weapon. When the police arrived, they were baffled. There were no signs of forced entry, and the killer seemed to have known the family well. The first theory that emerged was that the family had been murdered by someone they knew, someone close to them. But who could have done this? The Grubers had no known enemies. Their closest neighbors were miles away, and none of the locals had any reason to harm them. For months, the investigation yielded nothing. The police had no suspects, and every lead seemed to fizzle out. As I examined the scene, I learned that something particularly disturbing had occurred during the final days leading up to the murders. Andreas Gruber had mentioned to several people that he had been hearing strange noises coming from the attic for weeks before the murders. He had even told his neighbor about this, and the neighbor had come over to investigate but found nothing. I wondered how anyone could have lived in that house for days, unnoticed, especially with the family there. There was no way the Grubers could have been unaware of the intruder. Had they known? Had the killer been part of the family's life for a long time? And most importantly, why had no one heard anything? The entire village was in shock, and the silence that followed was deafening. Over the years, many theories emerged, but none of them ever provided the truth. Some believed that the Grubers had been killed by a distant relative, one who had come back seeking revenge. Others speculated that it was a local man, someone with a troubled past, who had been hiding out in the forest. But there were no solid leads. Theories were endless, but the facts remained sparse. One particularly strange theory that I encountered during my research involved the so-called ghost in the woods. Locals claimed that a spectral figure had been seen walking near the farmhouse, a tall man with dark hair, pacing back and forth. It was said that he would disappear into the woods, only to reappear days later. But what disturbed me the most was that someone, or something, had been living in the house after the murders. The killer had walked through the blood-stained rooms, used the family's possessions, and even slept in the beds of the murdered family members. The idea of a person living among the dead for days, undisturbed, was simply too disturbing to contemplate. As I walked through the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, some dark presence, was still there. The house seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something to happen. I spent hours there, taking pictures and trying to piece together the mystery. But as the sun began to set, the feeling of dread grew stronger. I left Hinterkaifeck that evening, but the memories of that night, of the eeriness that clung to that place, never left me. It became clear to me that the mystery of Hinterkaifeck was far from solved, and perhaps it was better that way. Some secrets are meant to stay buried in the past, hidden away in the shadows of forgotten farmhouses and desolate forests. But I can't shake the feeling that whatever evil lurks in the woods still watches, waiting for the day it will reveal itself once more. As I drove away, I looked back at the house one last time. Its windows, still dark and unwelcoming, stared back at me. And I knew, deep down, that I was leaving behind something far more sinister than I could ever understand. This wasn't just a murder story. It was a curse. And some mysteries, some things, are better left untouched.